I met Professor Nadje Al-Ali slightly more than a decade ago at a conference she organized at the University of Exeter in southwestern England. The conference honored two scholars who pushed Middle East studies in vital new directions. Edward Said, whose name you may know from his work on Orientalism, and Mohammed Arkoun, an Algerian who also wrote on Islam. It was a memorable meeting in a very beautiful place. I was impressed then with the competence and confidence of this young woman, and I began to pay attention to her work. In the subsequent decade, I have seen her take on an ever more prominent role in Middle East studies, and more particularly in the study of Middle Eastern women. Nadje Al-Ali is a citizen of the world. Born in Germany to an Iraqi father and a German mother, she made her way through German schools and rather assumed that she would eventually study German literature. But at age 9, when she was beginning to learn English, her parents set up a pen pal in Tucson, Arizona. Some 7 years later, she spent the summer in Tucson with her pen pal, and she loved it. Those are her words. So when she finished the gymnasium in Germany, her parents decided to help her spend a year in Tucson. There, quite unexpectedly, she discovered a strong program in Middle Eastern studies at the University of Arizona, and she enrolled. She began her study of Arabic there, and 3 years later, she went away with a BA degree and a strong interest in her father's culture. Her Arabic teacher at Arizona urged her to go to Cairo, which she did. There she spent 6 years perfecting her Arabic and pursuing a master's degree in anthropology and sociology. Then she went on to the School of Oriental and Africa Studies, which is a part of the University of London. There she completed a PhD degree in gender studies. She spent yet another year in Cairo doing research for her dissertation, which focused on the attitudes of women who call themselves secular in the Egyptian context. It became a book, Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, Egyptian Women's Movement, published by Cambridge University Press in the year 2000. Since the dissertation, Professor Al-Ali has turned her attention more and more to the study of Iraqi women. Her research has resulted in a number of articles and a couple of books. The most recent one, which she co-authored with a friend of hers, Nicola Pratt, is entitled What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation in Iraq. It was published by the University of California Press in 2009. Professor Al-Ali began her teaching career at the University of Sussex, which is not far from London. Then she moved to Exeter at the turn of the millennium. Turns out it was her first year there when she organized this conference. And then in 2007, she returned to SOAS, the School of Oriental and Africa Studies in London, and the place where she had earned her PhD. There now, she heads the Center for Gender Studies, which is a graduate program. In my class yesterday at Colorado College, Nadje described a number of scholarly projects which she is currently involved in, an incredible number, actually. But she's not just a scholar. She also considers herself an activist, involved particularly in an Iraqi feminist group and in a group opposing war and violence. I asked her whether she could sustain such a heavy set of commitments when she's actually teaching. Right now she's on sabbatical leave, which is why she's here. She replied that she would like to pull back just a bit, but when things were really ugly in Iraq a few years ago, her response was only to work harder and harder. Otherwise, I would have been in perpetual despair, she said. Maybe a more positive chain of events will help her achieve the kind of balance that she and other young scholars all covet. It's not that she lacks other interests. Her husband and daughter are two of them. Good food is another. It turns out that she and her husband do reviews of Middle Eastern restaurants in London. She says that's not work. I agree that's not work. Hiking is still another passion, and we hope to help her do a little of that this weekend. Before leaving London on Tuesday, I might say, Nadje was apparently singled out for special attention from the security folks. Arriving in Denver, she encountered an immigration officer who didn't seem enchanted by a German passport, an Arab name, and a declaration that she planned to lecture about Iraqi women. But despite a tone that conveyed suspicion, he let her into the country, and for that I am grateful. We're pleased to welcome you, Nadje, citizen of the world, to the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council to talk about conspiracy of science.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks so much. I'm really, really happy to be here. I really seek out opportunities to share my ideas, my knowledge, with people who are not academics. I think it is really important to try to reach out, and I think the academics often talk to very small circles. We are talking to each other, and it's really important, especially those of us who work on current affair issues, that we find a way to reach out to wider audiences. So I'm really, really happy to have this opportunity this evening. Oh, sorry. Okay, fine. Yes, tell me if I... So I'm not going to repeat that, though. Okay, so the title of my talk this evening is Conspiracy of Silence, Gender-Based Violence in... It's not the IRA, it's Iraq. Iraq is not in the media anymore. It's not very much in the media in the UK, and I suspect that it's not very much in the media in this country. I know that the attention now, of course, now these days, it's Libya and it's various countries of the Arab Spring, but it's also Afghanistan again and Pakistan. And there's also sort of a sense that we've reached kind of end of the official military occupation. The withdrawal of combat troops is imminent. There's less sectarian violence in Iraq. There are also less insurgent attacks, although I should say they still occur on almost a daily basis. We just don't hear about them. However, and this is probably surprising to you, there is still quite a bit of violence that is triggered by the government. And one of, for me, most depressing points is that what we actually see in Iraq emerging is a new dictatorship that is violently cracking down on any kind of political opposition. And there have been protests every Friday, protests against political corruption, protests for greater transparency. And over the last few months, there have been targeted assassinations of people who have been involved in organizing these protests. So there have been, these are not large-scale protests as we found in Tunisia or Egypt, but every Friday there are about 500 to 1,000 people who are protesting. This is Tahrir Square in Baghdad. So you have to look at me. What is very important to say that women are very much part of these protests. However, violence against women appears to be increasing in Iraq. Though Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Madre have published field reports, this violence remains one of the least studied aspects of post-invasion Iraq. It is underreported as well due to the stigma, the fear of retribution, and poor mechanisms of official documentation. Yet there are several indicators that violence against women has been on the rise. According to a women's rights activist in a provincial town which I interviewed a few months ago, she told me, I quote, "The general violence has decreased from last year, but violence against women is still increasing. Women complain of harassment on the street more than before. People comment on the way women dress and the way they walk. There's also violence against women prisoners. The government is not doing anything about this violence." Now, this activist observation concurs with a 2008 survey by Women for Women International, in which 63.9% of Iraqi women respondents stated that violence against women in general was increasing. Gender-based violence in Iraq has many sources. And now this might be sensitive here, but I am going to, throw this out to you. I would argue that the first source of violence is actually the US-led occupation. In addition to the fact that, of course, many civilians have been killed by aerial bombardments or random sniping, there also have been more gender-specific forms of violence at the hands of both the American and British occupation forces. There have been lots of documented cases of women who have been harassed during house searches and also at checkpoints. And when I say harassed, I mean both verbal harassment but also physical harassment, and really sort of lack of sensitivity in terms of women who had not their hair covered, or soldiers going in with dogs. And also there have been instances of women being arrested whose husbands or male relatives were actually suspected to be part of the insurgents, and some women have ended up many, many months in prison, and some of them have also been verbally and physically abused. Now, the next source of violence against women are the militia. And as I have already stated on several occasions during my 2-day stay here, for me, one of the most disturbing aspects of the violence that has occurred since 2003 is the fact that the armed gangs or the armed groups that are linked to the government, so there are militia that are linked to the government, to the elected parties, like for instance the Badr Brigade, which is part of the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolution. So these are militias that are linked to political parties that have been elected, that have been pro-invasion, pro-occupation, and armed groups that are part of the insurgents or resistance fighting the government and the occupation. The way they have been dealing with women is exactly the same. And this also cuts across Sunni and Shia groups. So a group, an armed group would characteristically move into a neighborhood, and the first thing they would be doing would be sort of to hand out leaflets and ask women to wear Islamic dress. Now, I interviewed lots of women who told me this is not a big deal. We were already not running around with miniskirts anyway, and as long as we can continue with our lives, it's not a problem. But it didn't stop there. In the next instance, women were threatened because they were active in civil society organizations and human rights organizations. Professional women were being threatened. Then women's mobility was being restricted. And at some point, women were targeted for driving. And in 2007, in Basra alone, 103 women were killed for allegedly not being Islamic enough. And this, as I show in the work with my colleague Nicola Pratt, is happening both by the groups linked to the government and those fighting by the government. Now, another source of violence are criminal gangs. I don't know of any middle-class family in Iraq that did not have at least one family member kidnapped. It's very, very common. In the early days of after the invasion, it usually meant that after a few days, when the family managed to put together a ransom, the person was returned. It later on took a more sinister twist, as some of the criminal gangs then also actually made deals with more political groups, and often people, even after they had handed over the ransom, the relatives were not returned, and they would find their bodies, if they found the bodies at all. And for women, the added danger for women was that there was a threat of physical abuse, sexual abuse, rape. And this is, I have to say, for me, the most difficult aspect to speak about, that there have been instances, and I really need to stress that you need to put this in proportion. I'm not speaking that it's widespread, but there have been instances when women were either arrested by American or British soldiers and spent time in prison, and there were question marks about whether they had been sexually abused in prison or women who had been kidnapped, when they were released afterwards, there have been some instances that then the families killed them because of a perception that the honor of the family was violated. Now, the Iraq Family Health Survey of 2006 to 2007, conducted by a consortium including the World Health Organization and the Iraqi Ministry of Health, questioned women about their violent encounters. The study found that overall, 21.2% of women had experienced physical violence, with a markedly higher percentage in the center and south than in the 3 northern provinces under the Kurdistan regional government. A total of 33.4% of women reported at least one form of emotional violence, ranging from insults to threats. The Iraqi Penal Code currently allows men to discipline their wives, quote, within certain limits prescribed by Islamic law, Sharia, by law or by custom, meaning that men are almost never arrested or prosecuted for maltreatment of female relatives. Moreover, some women do not regard domestic abuse as a crime. According to Sundus Abbas, director of the Iraqi Women's Leadership Institute in Baghdad, silence still marks all forms of domestic violence faced by women and girls in Iraq, because this form of violence is justified by the misinterpretation of religious text. Now, while religion and culture are often cited as explanations for this phenomenon, and not only in Iraq, it is more useful to look at the role of socioeconomic and political conditions on the ground. Several women activists believe that male violence against female relatives is linked to high rates of unemployment and poverty among men. Men who carry the stress back to the household. Sundus Abbas quotes a statistic from the Ministry of Planning. 27% of Iraqis lived below the poverty line in 2010. Meanwhile, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the unemployment rate for males aged 15 to 29 is 28%, compared to the national average of 18%. Female unemployment is also a huge problem that has deepened since 2003. The 2008 Women for Women International Survey, which gathered responses from approximately 1,500 women, found 45.3% describing their job opportunities as poor, and 26% saying that they had no opportunities at all. Widows and other female heads of household, who make up roughly 11% of all Iraqi households, and many of whom have been displaced by conflict, are particularly vulnerable to poverty linked to lack of employment. The government currently pays widows $60 to $100 a month, depending on the number of children. But this is clearly not enough for a woman to survive. Now, there are several reports indicating that women in poverty are vulnerable to sexual exploitation. The fragility of state institutions and the failure of the rule of law has created room for human trafficking gangs, especially for the trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation and prostitution. And this is a big problem now in Iraq. And no one has done research about it, but women's rights activists are starting to document the fact that some of the criminal gangs are abducting young Iraqi women, particularly to neighboring Syria and then also to the Gulf countries, and then they're forced into prostitution. Now, corruption and impunity within the security services is sadly widespread in today's Iraq. As one woman, the founder of an Iraqi NGO assisting women in poverty, lamented, and I quote, "Human rights violations are one of the most important lessons that Iraqi security forces have learned from the US and British militaries." And I should say, I hold both the US and the British military responsible for turning a blind eye when there were signs, the first signs of human rights violations on behalf of the Iraqi security forces. Although I would argue that they did not need the US or Britain to teach them human rights violations, Iraqi women activists interviewed for this talk spoke of women prisoners who are still subject to abuse in Iraqi police stations. Activists are not given access to the prisoners, but believe that the authorities have done nothing to redress the problem. Now, such ill treatment fits into the larger picture of torture and abuse by Iraqi security forces, documented by Human Rights Watch and also Amnesty International. And there are currently at least 4 to 5 illegal detention centers in Iraq where prisoners disappear and where they're, regularly tortured. Now, political developments have helped to normalize this violence. Conservative or misogynistic interpretations of religious texts have become pervasive, as religious parties and tribal figures have come to power through elections, with the complicity of the US occupation authorities. And I should say, a picture like this, if I show this picture to Iraqi women, and older Iraqi women, they tell me, this is not Iraq. This has nothing to do with Iraq. This is not something that is traditional to Iraq. It's not something that historically women were wearing. This is a new post-2003 phenomenon. These are women linked to the Sadrist movement. You might have heard of the Shia Islamist cleric Muqtada Sadr. It's a Shia Islamist group. And on certain occasions, certain days, women wear this, which, some people say, oh, they're going backwards. But they are not going backwards because that never happened in Iraq before. It's a very new phenomenon. It's not widespread. You don't see the majority of women, wearing full face cover, but it happens among certain communities, especially in the south, and those linked to the Sadrist movement. Militias, many of which are linked to parties in government, are involved in the harassment of women on the streets and checkpoints, and very much also based on how they're dressed. These paramilitaries have also intimidated and even murdered professional women with impunity. But what I found most disturbing is the fact that, according to several women I interviewed, even ordinary people on the street have become agents of control and repression. One Baghdad-based academic and women's rights activist put it this way, and I quote, "As a woman these days, you feel under pressure to obey all the time. People make comments about what you wear and what you do, and when you're out and about. It is really increasingly difficult to go out by yourself. It was much easier before. A male family member always has to be with you if you want to go anywhere. The regulation of Iraqi women's bodies in the name of culture and identity is a crucial mechanism for the consolidation of the authority of the religious and tribal leaders dominating Iraq's political institutions today. In this environment, many women stay at home and anxious parents are pulling their young girls out of school." How much time do I have left? Okay. Now let me move to Iraqi Kurdistan. Because really, Iraqi Kurdistan poses a paradox. I should say that these days, I still do not dare to travel to Baghdad, although I have relatives there, but they tell me, please, don't come. It's still too dangerous for you, especially working on women's rights issues. But I regularly go to Iraqi Kurdistan, where it's safe for me to travel and where I feel really fine to go. So overall, the region enjoys far greater security than southern and central Iraq. After years of struggling with punitively limited state provisions, whether in electricity, housing, or employment, the infrastructure and economy of Kurdistan appears to be on the mend. Investors have pumped in some $14 billion since 2005, and no visitor, particularly to Erbil, which is one of the main towns, can fail to notice the changes in the urban landscape. Every time I go, it looks different. Yet corruption, nepotism, and political intimidation continue to plague the Kurdistan regional government. Civil society organizations, including women's rights organizations, have mushroomed since the early 1990s when Baghdad withdrew its army from the Kurdish areas. But these groups also remain dependent on the goodwill of the main political parties, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is linked to Barzani, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, linked to Talabani. The KRG, the Kurdish regional government, is officially supportive of combating violence against women and has developed a strategy to counter it, working closely with politicians, women's rights activists, academics, and international experts, and often with international funding bodies. Nevertheless, the KRG encompasses an array of voices on gender issues, from secular-oriented pro-women's rights politicians with links to the Kurdish women's movement and international organizations, to politicians with links to religious and tribal leaders. With the debates between these camps unresolved, the situation on the ground continues to be critical. Now, there has been actually an increase of the phenomenon of the so-called honor killings. So honor killings referring to the killing of a woman when she is suspected of having engaged in an illicit sexual encounter. The case of Dua Khalil Aswad, who was stoned to death in the street by a group of men in April 2007 at Bashika near Mosul, made headlines internationally. Aged 17 and a member of Iraq's Yazidi religious community, it's a religious minority, her offense in the eyes of the men in her family and community was that she had formed an attachment to a young Sunni Muslim man. But not only was she killed, but the murder was filmed by an onlooker or by many onlookers on their mobile phone and then widely circulated on the internet. In 2002, under pressure from the activists, the Kurdish regional government amended the penal code to remove the honorable motive clause in cases involving crimes against women. Since then, killings in the name of honor are reported much more widely, but many cases still go unremarked. Moreover, Kurdish women activists say that only very few men have actually been persecuted for killing their female relatives. So there is a law, but it's not really being implemented. Now, while the killings are certainly its most gruesome form in terms of honor-based crimes, violence in the name of honor actually encompasses a broad spectrum of practices, from policing of clothes and comportment to denial of education and also maiming. Violence and repression within the family have resulted in a high rate of suicides amongst women. And there is a phenomenon, and some Kurdish women's rights activists tell me that it's an epidemic of especially young Kurdish women burning themselves, which is a most common form of suicide. And sometimes, though, people don't know whether it was a suicide, or whether it was an honor-based killing, and then afterwards the family burned the woman and said it was a suicide. There are also concerns among civil society groups about widespread female genital mutilations in northern Iraq. A 2009 survey by the Iraqi Kurdistan Ministry of Human Rights suggests that in one district, over 40% of women and girls aged 11 to 24 have been subjected to such an operation. A Human Rights Watch report surveying a wider geographical area gives even higher figures. Female genital mutilation can be a life-threatening procedure, particularly in places that have no emergency health care facilities, as in many rural parts of Iraqi Kurdistan. Some girls and young women have bled to death after being cut. Now, despite the progress made by some sections of the government, the media and women's rights organizations, there are huge challenges ahead, particularly beyond the main cities. So in the cities, the situation is really quite different, but in the villages and the mountains, there are lots of problems. In 2010, the Iraqi government, in partnership with the UN, participated in the global campaign called 16 Days of Activism to End Violence Against Women, which runs annually from November 25th to December 10th. Under the slogan, Unite to End Violence Against Women in Iraq, Iraq's first such national effort aimed to increase awareness of gender-based violence among Iraqis and to highlight the positive role that can be played by Iraqi males, especially decision makers and community leaders. According to Khulud Sami, then State Minister of Women's Affairs, the landmark campaign would inaugurate a 4-year national strategy culminating in a reformed family protection law. Yet women's rights activists complained that very little is actually being done by the official level in central and southern Iraq. One activist argued, "We can clearly see a denial of this phenomenon, the phenomenon being violence against women. The government considers any discussion of it as an attempt to harm the society. One might even contend that the Iraqi government is contributing to the increase in violence against women by failing to crack down on armed militias, criminal gangs, and Islamist groups who have been targeting women systematically. Neither is the government acting to curb domestic violence, which is rarely persecuted through the legal system. Iraqi NGOs in several governorates have tried to address this problem by providing legal aid, family mediation, and medical services to women who have been victims of violence. Women's shelters do not exist in South and Central Iraq. There are a couple of shelters in the Kurdish areas. Women subject to domestic violence are left with little remedy, but mediation, which will often encourage them to actually return to the family home. Now, let me conclude by saying that most Iraqi women activists agree that violence against women in Iraq has risen noticeably since 2003. Yet the increase is little known, much less the scandal that it should be, because so many of the victims and their families keep silent out of fear. Meanwhile, I would argue, US officials avert their eyes. Iraqi authorities deny the problem and accuse those who raise the issue of dishonoring Iraq. The failure of the US and its Iraqi allies to address the phenomenon of violence against women is not surprising, for it is linked to the deterioration of the Iraqi economy, the corruption of national institutions, the lack of social services, and the rise of ethno-religious political leaders that have accompanied the sanctions, war, and civil strife that the US and its proxies have inflicted upon the country. Combating violence against women in Iraq means combating its structural causes. Thank you.
Are there questions for Nadje Al-Ali? The question is whether under Saddam Hussein the level of violence against women was lower than it has been since 2003 or unreported. Is that right?
Both, I would say. So I think there was a different form of violence. I mean, under Saddam Hussein, most of the violence was state violence based on political opposition. So if you were part of the opposition, or also, obviously, there was at some point a targeting of Shia and Kurds. Certainly the government used gender-based violence, particularly rape, to intimidate prisoners and also, again, women who were linked to political opposition, no doubt about it. But if you ask most women, and I'm not, I mean, there are very, very few women who would still sing Saddam's praises. I mean, most women I talk to, think about the previous regime as a terrible dictatorship, engaged in human rights atrocities. But most women would tell you that they felt more safe during the previous regime. They, bringing their children to school, being able to go to work themselves. And that is partly because, it was a centralized authoritarian authoritarian state, it was a police state. So there was violence, there was state violence, but there was not the kind of much crime on the street because people were too scared and the state was very strong. And also, I mean, at some point, the Iraqi government, as I was saying in a talk yesterday, actually took an active role in trying to promote women's education and women's labor force participation. And there was some kind of push by the government to support women to be part of the public life. And this is not because Saddam Hussein or the Ba'ath regime was believing in egalitarian principles, but I think it was very much because of economic reasons. After the oil crisis in the early 70s and the oil prices shot up, there was an economic boom in Iraq. And with the economic boom, there was an expanding labor market. And while some of the oil-producing countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia very much relied on importing labor from outside, the Iraqi government decided to use its own human resources, and 50% were women. So in the 70s, you know, when you listen to the speeches by Saddam Hussein or other politicians, the good Iraqi woman is the educated working woman working side by side with men. And you know, they were very generous. Childcare was free, very generous maternity benefits. So in a way, the state did play an active role to try to promote women to be part of public life. That changed quite drastically in the 90s during the sanctions period when you had economic downturn, when you had large-scale unemployment. And at that time, Saddam Hussein came out and said, you know, the good Iraqi woman is the woman who stays at home and looks after the children. I mean, this is the same president who in the 70s told us that the good woman is the one who goes out to work. So what I'm trying to say, you know, you can't reduce that to culture or religion, but it's very much changing socioeconomic conditions on the ground. I do think that there is an issue when people say there's an increase in honor-based crimes, for instance, in Iraqi Kurdistan. I often wonder, or also in central and southern Iraq, is there really the increase or is there an increased better reporting? So I think that that is certainly an issue, and I'm sure that there were lots of cases of gender-based violence that we're just not aware about before. But when you look at issues around security, you know, women being able to walk on the street, to be able to go to work, to walk their children to school, I would argue that it was definitely safer before 2003.
The question you may have heard is whether the problem is in fact not permanent, because as long as Sharia law is detrimental to women, these abuses will go on, and she argues that perhaps no foreign country can do anything about this.
Well, that specific law that I was referring to, the Penal Code, is a new law that was instituted after 2003 that actually did not exist prior to 2003. I think people have this idea when they think about Sharia law that, you know, there is sort of a book and you can sort of go to page 13 and you find this or that article. But Islamic law is wide open to interpretation, and in many countries in the Middle East, Muslim countries, you actually have a situation where most of the laws are based on some civil codes, on secular law. But then there's just most of the laws around family laws are often based on Islamic law. And actually Iraq, since 1959, there was a revolution in 58 that changed Iraq from a monarchy to a republic. And so a new constitution was drafted. And in this new constitution, Iraq got one of the most progressive personal status codes in the whole Middle East. Personal status code is also based on Islamic law. But you can have a whole range. I mean, the personal status code in Saudi Arabia is totally different from the personal status code in in Morocco. So it's very much also about who is deciding what the law is. You know, you can stretch it quite a bit. And in Iraq, since 59, the law was progressive in that, for instance, a man could not just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, but he actually had to go to court. Or a man could not just marry a second wife or a third wife, he actually had to get the permission of the first wife. So that, in comparison to many other countries in the region, and we're speaking 1959, was actually very progressive. Now, after 2003, they're trying to implement a more conservative law. And yes, of course, you know but what I'm saying is that this happens under the eyes, under the auspices of the United States, that one reason to go there was to bring democracy and women's rights to the country. But actually what has happened is that there has been, United States has turned a blind eye, as there have been certain politicians who have now the power and are establishing a new dictatorship and are trying to implement more conservative interpretations of Islamic law than they existed prior to 2003. I mean, okay, so if I had the choice, would I go with the status quo today in 2011? Or would I go back 10 years prior, I mean, we're speaking 2001, prior to the invasion. And so would I go with that, or would I go with the now? Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, it's kind of asking people, you know, do you want to die in hell, or do you want to die in, I don't know, other hell? I mean, I think it's really kind of an impossible question, because you're asking me, am I choosing dictatorship with sanctions, or lawless situation with new dictatorship? So, I mean, I really think that Iraqis should be able to have a better choice than that. I think so. I think that they deserve better than, you know, either one. Let me put it differently. There are lots of, I mean, I've maybe over the last 6-7 years, I've interviewed maybe 300 Iraqi women of different ethnic and religious backgrounds, different generations. And when they reminisce about the past, I mean, one thing that is really striking, that it seems that every decade, when they think about the previous decade, they sort of think about it with nostalgia. And that's not because the previous decade was so bad, but because the following decade was even worse. So I think many Iraqis by 2001 had come to a point where they felt we can't continue like that. Because not only were they suffering from dictatorship, but they were also suffering from sanctions. And I think there's lots of amnesia about the fact that 13 years of the most comprehensive sanction system ever imposed on the country had a devastating impact on Iraqi society. It was a terrible humanitarian crisis. It certainly had a negative impact on women and gender relations. And so lots of people by 2001 wanted change. And lots of people were supporting the invasion. Not all, I don't know, you know, I can't put sort of numbers to it. I know, I mean, even with my family, I have a large extended family, it was divided. Some family members were supportive of the invasion, and some family members were against the invasion. You know, even within families, you know, same ethnic group, same religious group, maybe even same political persuasion, people were divided over it, okay? And I should say, giving my family as an example, the first couple of years, even despite difficulties, there was lots of hope. You know, there was sort of a sense, okay, things are difficult now, but we're getting there. You know, we will be getting there. But they're not saying that anymore. They don't have hope now anymore. And I've actually, I had several family members killed, and I know lots of people had family members killed, people who have fled. These are people who I've had a uncle executed by Saddam Hussein. So certainly my family was not a lover of the previous regime. But now when you ask them, they said, it was better before. I personally don't want to engage in these comparisons. I don't think people should have to make those choices. And I don't think it's very helpful to make these comparisons. But that's the fact that lots of people are saying that. And it's not because the situation was any good then, because it wasn't good, but because it's so bad now. And what is really, okay, so we went through a phase of really outright sectarian violence. That's much better now. The level of insurgents is not as bad as it was, but it is on a daily basis, it's still happening. You know, in places like Baghdad, I mean, in many cities, almost no day, no week passes by when there's not a bomb exploding. But the most, for me, I mean, the most frustrating thing is that what we see happening right now is a new dictatorship emerging. I mean, Nouri Maliki is another dictator in the making. And no one pays attention to this. I mean, that I find really very, very frustrating. We needed to go through all this to get there. You have a situation where people are killed because they're organizing protests against the government. We have a situation where people are arrested because they're writing something in a newspaper that's against the government. I have friends who teach at the university and they're worried to speak out because they think they might be arrested. You know, what for all this if we get to the same situation? And I think there is a problem that at some point, I think, when the violence was really bad, there was a kind of sense, okay, what we need is national security. It doesn't matter how, even if it means another strong man. And all the sort of ideas about democracy, about human rights, have gone out of the window. And that's really what is frustrating people as well. You know, if you would see that, okay, there are difficulties, the economy is not doing so well, okay, well, you know, we have some problems with violence, but things are moving and we have a democratic government, we have freedom of expression. I think people could live with that and they would be patient, but it's not like that. We're going back in terms of, you know, an authoritarian dictatorship that is actively involved in human rights abuses.
The question, which you may have heard, but I'm repeating for the benefit of those taping, is whether a new Shiite majority affects, how this affects things.
Yes, so historically, had a situation where while the majority of the population, the Muslim population, was Shia in terms of political decision-making, they have historically been a minority, a political minority, and the Sunni demographic minority has been in power, okay? Having said that, there have been, I mean, in the Ba'ath Party, there were Shia members high up in the Ba'ath Party. You had Shia generals, you also had Shia ministers, but certainly there has been a sense, and there has been, this has been documented clearly, that Shia have been politically sidelined. First of all, I would say that when we speak about the Shia, we also have to distinguish between different kinds of Shia. Now, there are Shia, the Shia that we now, in terms of the government parties, these are Shia Islamist political parties. When I say Islamist, I mean the political movement linked to Islam. So these are people who want an Islamic state, who want the implementation of Sharia law. And there are two main Shia Islamist political parties. There's the Dawa party, Nouri al-Maliki, and then there is a party of the Supreme Council that is very closely linked to Iran. Okay? Now, there are lots of Shia in Iraq who do not feel represented by these political parties because they don't actually want an Islamic state. These are secular Shia, you know, who want to continue to live in a secular state as they did before. And as I've argued before in other contexts, class actually plays a very important part. So for instance, my family, well, I can tell you, so my grandparents were what I call Sushi. So my grandmother was Sunni and my grandfather was Shia, which made the generation of my father Shia, so because it goes according to the line of the father. They were living in a middle-class neighborhood in Baghdad. Now, they had much more, and they continued to have much more in common with their Sunni middle-class neighbors or their Christian middle-class neighbors than the Shia who live in Sadr city or in the south of Iraq. So actually class identity, sort of middle-class identity, and also urban identity continues to be a very important sort of marker of identity of people. And they don't feel that they are being represented by these Shia Islamist political parties. That's one thing to say. The second thing to say is that I think that some elements of the Shia are using the fact that historically they have been sidelined to now target Sunnis. And I think that is one reason why we've seen the radicalization of Sunnis. And again, I would hold the US responsible. In the beginning, the Shia were the good guys. And so when some of the Shia militias were involved in killing, torturing Sunnis, they did not say a thing, and they turned a blind eye because the Sunnis were the bad guys. And in the name of de-Baathification, lots of Sunnis have been expelled from jobs, although they were just in the Baath Party as many Shia were as well. I mean, almost everyone was in the Baath Party. So I think, unfortunately, what we see in Iraq today is this kind of, these hierarchies of suffering. So I suffered more than you in the past, and therefore I am entitled to more resources, to more political power. Of course, that alienates a large segment of the population. And I understand why many Sunnis do feel disenfranchised in Iraq today. Well, the question being whether I think of Iraq as a unique case or whether it is more reflective of wider processes in terms of prejudice against women, what was the other point? Violence, and yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I would disagree with sort of the statement that, you can characterize the region in terms of prejudice against women. I mean, what I was trying, I didn't really do it so much today, this evening, because I was focusing on violence. But usually what I'm actually trying to do is give some historical background about Iraq and the situation of women. So, what I would argue is that the kind of prejudice and discrimination against women is much stronger now, post-2003, than it was before, okay? So in that sense, it is unique. It's unique to the Iraqi context. But however, at the same time, I agree with you that there are certain developments that are actually regional. So if you compare the region now with, let's say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, during that period, secular ideological frameworks and political parties were really prominent. So either in the sense of Arab nationalism or even socialism, these were kind of the main frameworks in which kind of post-colonial nation building happened in the region. But since sort of the late 70s, and then of course there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, there has been a rise of Islamist political parties and a shift towards more sort of greater conservatism with respect to gender norms. Having said that, really each country is so different from another. I mean, I lived in Cairo for 6 years, and I have to say, I mean, a middle-class, urban Cairene women, I felt had a much better life than a middle-class woman in London or in Frankfurt, or I felt, she was able to have a family and have a career and still have a social life. Yeah, she had a much better support network. Very different from, let's say, the woman in Saudi Arabia, where, we really have very basic issues to struggle against. So I think it's very important to not generalize, but to look at the specificities, and not just in terms of one country to another, that there are huge variations, but even within a country, huge differences. I mean, urban women have very, very different lives from women in the countryside. There are huge differences, and often I think that women, whether they live in Tehran, in Baghdad, in Istanbul, in Cairo, actually live quite similar to women in Washington, Rome, London. But if you go to the countryside, the gap is really, really big. And also the gap is very big along class lines in terms of sort of upper class, middle class women and women of sort of low income background. Huge gaps. So I think we need to be careful in terms of generalizing about women and also attitudes towards women.